Hello, good evening, and welcome to Prog Chattery 777. We are, of course, talking about the Mars Volta, and we are beginning with their first album, De-loused in the Comatorium. This is, of course, their first feature-length album. They did release the Tremulant EP, which was in 2001 or 2002. I'm not too sure, unfortunately. But this is their first full-length album, and as a debut album, it is utterly fantastic. Surely it is one of the great debut albums out there, in that it is a band that is totally confident with what it's doing and what it's setting out to do, and it's firing on absolutely all cylinders, and it's a definitive moment for the Mars Volta. I actually compare it in some ways to Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, in that all of the following albums that came after this in some way makes some kind of reference to the foundations that are laid with De-loused in the Comatorium. It's the foundation for everything that the band was to become in the following 9 years. It's having been released in 2003. It is surely one of the greatest progressive albums of 2003. I think I said before in my introductory video, I think the Mars Volta is probably the best prog band to come out post-70s, after that classic period of progressive rock and all that, when it almost hit the mainstream. A lot of bands came afterwards. Of course, Marillion was big in the 80s, and Dream Theater and Tool, Primus, those guys were doing their thing in the 90s, and it's all really, really good stuff, but the Mars Volta, I think, really captures the spirit of that original progressive movement of the late 60s, early 70s. And you really feel that vibe with this album. It's such a completely eclectic mix of so many different styles. That's what makes it progressive. That, and there's the long songs and the crazy instrumental passages and whatnot, but it draws on Latin influences. Obviously, the Mars Volta kind of rose from the ashes of a band called At the Drive-In, so and they were a post-punk, sort of hardcore punk kind of a band. I'm not sure how to categorize those things, but it certainly has that very aggressive edge to it. It has that visceral punk energy. So that's thrown into the mix, and there's lots of long, winding instrumental passages that some harken back to the psychedelic things of the 60s, like Echoes by Pink Floyd or whatever. And there's a big King Crimson influence as well. I already mentioned Court of the Crimson King, but I think in general there's a great Crimson influence across a lot of the Mars Volta. But that's not to say it's just what I've said. I mean, it's a huge range of styles that are brought in. I should have mentioned the band members earlier. Of course, the Mars Volta has got Cedric Bixler-Zavala on vocals. He writes the melodies, and it's a very melodic album too. The Mars Volta in general are very, very melodic. It's kind of masked with all the craziness, but Cedric's contribution in terms of melody is huge. We also have, of course, Omar Rodriguez-Lopez, who is the guitar player and musical arranger, and those two, Cedric and Omar, form the Mars Volta, who then direct and command the Mars Volta group, which was kind of a shifting array of musicians. But on this album, we do, of course, have John Theodore, the great John Theodore, on drums. I think he was probably the best drummer for the Mars Volta. He's there. Of course, we have Isaiah Owens on the keyboards. He was a long-standing member. Who else is on this particular record? Flea, of course. We have to mention Flea of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He was the bass player on this album, and Jeremy Michael Ward, who's credited for sound manipulation, and he kind of contributes to those psychedelic passages I was talking about earlier. So yeah, it's a very broad range, and those two in particular, Omar and Cedric, they seem to be influenced by absolutely everything. I mean, there's like I said, I've already mentioned Crimson a few times, but I mean, in Cedric's vocals, you hear stuff like Bjork, and you hear even a bit of Kate Bush as well comes through in his vocals. They're influenced by absolutely everybody, and they just throw it all into the melting pot, and you get these brilliant albums. So anyway, let's start focusing on this one, the first one. De-loused in the Comatorium, of course, is a concept album, although that term should be used fairly loosely when talking about the Mars Volta, because you know, it's not like The Wall or something like that where the concept is laid out and there's a very specific storyline and a specific plot. Um, you know, the songs are all sort of linked. There's a very cinematic quality to, and not just their concept albums, but Mars Volta albums in general, a very cinematic quality. And, you know, it's not so much what the words literally mean, it's the, you know, it's the images that they conjure up in your head. It's a very visual band, so it's, you know, between the images that, you know, pop up in your head thanks to Cedric's lyrics, or, you know, the images that come into your head thanks to Omar's crazy musical end of things. You know, they, with all that imagery, they make scenes, and you get, you know, flashes of, it's very hallucinogenic almost. You get these flashes of weird scenes and images that flash before you, and it's supposedly all rounded up in a concept. The idea behind this album, it's a tribute to Julio Venegas, who was a friend of Omar and Cedric's who had passed away. I don't think it's biographical in that sense, but the concept has to do with someone named Cerpin Taxt, is the main character's name, and he is in a coma after overdosing on morphine and rat poison. And the images that come through the songs are supposedly the subconscious images of the subconscious journey that Mr. Taxt takes while in this coma, which is a mind-blowing and crazy, you know, concept art, a great concept art for a prog album. So we'll kind of talk about the songs, and we'll see if we can make any sense of it. But I don't think you're supposed to make any sense of it. So it opens with Lumiere. Lumiere. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. My French is terrible, in spite of learning French in school. Sorry about that. This serves as a little intro to the first proper song, which is Inertiatic ESP. And both of these pieces, even though they're labeled track 1 and 2, kind of form a cohesive whole as far as I'm concerned. I think Sonne Lumiere is a fantastic atmospheric intro. You get all these kind of windy sounds and very creepy and whimsical, and you get this. Omar plays this line. Either he's consciously doing it or it's just a coincidence. I think he's consciously doing it, but he's making the sound that an ambulance would make as it's rushing off to the scene. So I think it represents this Cerpin Taxt character's last fleeting images of consciousness before he dives into his coma. And that winds its way into the first song, which is, of course, as I mentioned, Inertiatic ESP. And it is a phenomenal track. I mean, it sends the album right into high gear. You really get that punk influence, very fast lines, very start-stop, and very visceral and aggressive and over the top. But it still has there's still lots of changes that kind of go in and out that happen within it, which is really, really great. It's a classic song. It was performed live, I think, pretty much right through their entire career. Great way to open the show. I saw them live in 2009, and they opened with it. And yeah, really good stuff. Really, you're introduced to Cedric's vocals as they just kind of bellow out, and you know, it's incredible. Introduced to Omar's guitar playing as well, that very jagged, raunchy style that he has. Omar's certainly not a virtuoso player. He's not about he's not about, look at this, I can play this. It's very jagged. It's ragged around the edges, and I think that contributes to the style of the Mars Volta, and any project that he brings that style towards. It's very unique, and it's great. Inertiatic ESP winds its way into Roulette Dares, the second proper song of the album, or in brackets, The Haunt Of, and it's a phenomenal track. First time you really get to hear Cedric's great sense of melody. It's a phenomenal melody that he's got in there. And it's a great pop hook too. I mean, there's a pop influence to the Mars Volta as well. That whole exoskeletal line is very dramatic. It slows things down a little bit from Inertiatic ESP, but it's still very high energy, still very bludgeoning, very intense, and just a great song. This winds its way into, forgive my pronunciation once again, Tira mi alas araña, which is, I don't know what that means. I'm sure it's on Wikipedia. I probably read it yesterday. But it's a nice little instrumental sieg. You just get some kind of exotic acoustic guitar chords and some synth lines slowly wash over top of it. And that winds its way into Drunkship of Lanterns. This was always the standout track for me when I first got into the album. You really hear the Latin influence, but it's still played with that, crazy aggressive punk energy. Towards the middle, you get a really kind of proggy switch up between two rhythmic backgrounds. You get that boom 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 boom, which is it kind of bounces back and forth between that and a different rhythmic slant, which is really, really cool. And then, as it winds its way up, it really, really gets intense, which of course is a Volta trademark, is that intensity of playing. That leads into Eriatarka, or Eriatarka, I'm not really sure. There's going to be a lot of mispronunciations in this whole series, I'm afraid. Which is a pretty good song. It's kind of the middle song of the album. I guess you could call it the album track. It's not one of my favorites. It does have a great kind of juxtaposition between the slow, jangly guitar line verse, and then the more energetic choruses, which is cool, but it's definitely not a standout track on the album for me. Then we move into the first kind of proper epic of the album, which is Cicatriz ESP, the second ESP song. I think amongst the hardcore Volta fans, this is probably like the centerpiece of the album. It's definitely the longest song on the album. I wouldn't say it's the best on the album, though. I really, really like it, don't get me wrong. The actual song kind of portion of it, the beginning and the end, I'm not quite as big a fan of. The chorus doesn't quite grab me. The whole I'm defective section isn't necessarily my cup of tea. It's very Mars Volta, but it's not my favorite aspect of the Mars Volta. The really great thing about Cicatriz ESP, though, is the middle section, which it stretches into a very long. This is where you really see that earlier mid-60s, mid-late 60s psychedelic sound kind of come out. Very atmospheric. It does remind me. Sections of it remind me of Echoes by Pink Floyd. So that's really cool. It kind of gives the ear a bit of a break, because it's all been very loud and intense so far. And then it winds into another kind of Latin influence section, which is really, really cool. And then it winds its way back into the song, which, like I said, is okay as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, still a great track. Then from there we go to This Apparatus Must Be Unearthed. Now this is contender for my favorite song on the album, actually. I really, really like This Apparatus Must Be Unearthed. Really, really good song, and it's kind of got a definitive Mars Volta thing to it. I mean, if someone were to ask you what does the Mars Volta sound like, I would probably play This Apparatus Must Be Unearthed. It's got that urgent frenzy to it. It's got that. It does have a great hook that I've been waiting for so long. It really, really draws you in, and probably one of the more conventional songs on the album. But it's got that sound. It's got that visceral, urgent, aggressive, and epic quality. It definitely feels like you're coming towards the end of the album. It's very epic and grand, and all the rest of it. Great track. Like I said, one of my favorites on the album. This takes us to Televators, which is the slow ballad of the album. Nice and acoustic. Again, more conventional than some of the other stuff that they've done. But a very, very good track. It's not one of my favorites. It's never been a standout Volta track for me, but I think it is for a lot of people. It certainly stands out on the album just because it's much quieter and much more tranquil and serene. I think they chose a really good spot on the album for it. Because one of the if there is a big fault with the Mars Volta, it's the production value. You talk about the loudness wars and highly compressed music. I think the Mars Volta suffers from that because everything is just fully at you at absolute peak, and you don't really have those nice little dynamic peaks and valleys, you know what I mean? And the music it's in the music. The peaks and valleys are in the music, but it's not really represented in the production value, in the production quality rather. So you can get ear fatigue. That's the point. And I think Televators comes at just the right point in the album, because your ears are starting to get a little bit tired by this point, and kind of gives you a nice, spacious song to rest for a little bit. Which then, of course, after the nice build-up, it is a slow crescendo, we reach the finale of the album, the second big epic as far as I see it, Take the Veil, Cerpin, Taxt. And I like this one much more than Cicatriz ESP, I must say. I think the song itself is totally there, and the instrumental section is just far and away one of the definitive Mars Volta moments, I think. Comes out with this one section that is very reminiscent of Lark's Tongues and Aspic, I must say. There's this jangly guitar line, and then that kind of explodes into a frenzy, and then we get this kind of cool, laid-back groove with these arpeggiated... Really cool stuff. And again, like I said, definitive Mars Volta moment. All works its way back, and it doesn't reprise the chorus, funnily enough, when it finally comes back, which is interesting. I like that. And kind of comes to a sudden and crunching end, and then you're kind of left dazed and confused, and that's exactly what a good album does to you, I think, because it should leave you wondering. A good album makes you wonder. I'm not satisfied by just, oh, that's the thing, that's good. You're kind of blown away by this stuff, which for any band is really good. For a debut album by a very young band at the time, this is absolutely fantastic. Especially considering I think they were still on lots of drugs at the time. They cleaned themselves up fairly early on, but I think a lot of this stuff was still sort of druggy. But yeah, I'm not judging or anything, obviously. Oh, dropped something here. What was the other thing I was going to mention? Oh yeah, with regards to Omar and his kind of his role as musical arranger of the band, he had this famous way. Well, I guess I'm saying famous. This weird way of composing, where he would give the musicians in the band, each one of them would have specific instructions and play this for this long, and then do this kind of fill, and he'd work with them individually and record them all individually, so all the musicians didn't really hear the final product, the finished product, until the album was finished. I'm not sure if he employed that technique on this album. I know he would on future albums. I know Francis the Mute was done that way. Pretty much, possibly nearly all of them. Nocturniquet and Octahedron, I think he may have loosened up a little bit, but I'm kind of unclear as to whether or not he was that commanding at this point, because they do have a live feel. It's got that, the band sounds like they're tight on the arrangements. It sounds like a band that knows what they're doing. Well, they obviously always were, but sounds like a band that has played the songs that are on the album. But yeah, I think that just about covers it for the Mars Volta's debut album, De-loused in the Comatorium. As I'm going to say with any of their albums, if you are a fan of progressive music of any era, and you have not gotten into the Mars Volta, you really ought to give them a try. They are very intense, but once you kind of adjust to that intensity and you get used to where they're coming from, they are an absolutely phenomenal band. So definitely, if you don't have this album, you must pick it up. Get it in your life. It's very good, and it's got a very good cover by Storm Thurgeson as well. Very proggy. And on that note, I will thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Take care.